I mean, that's the story of my life. No respect. I don't get no respect at all. Are you kidding? No respect at all. Well, when I was born, the doctor told my mother I did all I could, but he pulled through anyway, you know? I don't get no respect from anyone. Well, I called up suicide prevention. They tried to talk me into it.
Before we begin, a brief note. Everything you're about to hear is based on verified historical sources. From the memoir, It's Not Easy Being Me, the first-hand account of Rodney's second wife, Joan Child, and medical records from the UCLA Medical Center. We respect the facts, and throughout this story, we'll separate the truth from the many myths that have grown around him. Rodney Dangerfield spent his entire life joking that nobody respected him. But his final joke turned out to be as chilling as a cruel prophecy. In 2004, at the age of 82, Rodney was wheeled into the operating room for heart valve replacement surgery. When doctors asked how long he expected to stay in the hospital, he couldn't resist cracking one last joke. "If all goes well, I'll be here about a week, if not about an hour and a half." Tragically, those words became reality. Severe post-operative complications left him in a deep coma, and he never recovered. The man who made America roar with laughter through the immortal line, "I don't get no respect," left this world almost exactly the way he had predicted. But no respect was never just a comedy routine. It was an echo of the pain carried by an abandoned child and a man who had battled clinical depression since the age of 15. Behind the laughter was a Rodney who often hid backstage, taking tranquilizers before every performance. Even his signature red tie tug, the gesture audiences thought was part of the act, was actually an involuntary reaction whenever overwhelming anxiety left him feeling suffocated and unable to breathe. On stage, Rodney constantly joked about his uncaring mother and his miserable childhood. As it turned out, those punchlines weren't exaggerated at all. They were born from a childhood so brutally lonely that it bordered on unimaginable. On November 22, 1921, in the small town of Babylon on Long Island, New York, a baby named Jacob Rodney Cohen entered the world. But from the moment he opened his eyes, fate seemed unwilling to offer him a warm welcome. His birth certificate listed his parents Philip Cohen and Dorothy Teitelbaum as little more than cold legal facts. It couldn't create the loving home he would never truly have. His father, Philip Cohen, was a vaudeville performer and professional juggler who performed under the stage name Phil Roy. In the early decades of the 20th century, entertainers like Phil Roy spent their lives chasing theater lights from one state to another. He loved the applause of strangers far more than the cries of his own children. To Philip, family felt like a cramped cage that restricted his restless spirit. Not long after Jacob was born, Philip quietly packed his bags, loosened his bow tie, threw on his old wool overcoat, and walked out the front door. He abandoned his young wife and their two children, Jacob, and his older sister Marion, to face a merciless reality, alone. His disappearance left behind an enormous void, carving the first deep wound into young Jacob's heart, the unbearable feeling of being abandoned. The burden of survival fell squarely onto the shoulders of his mother Dorothy, Dottie Teitelbaum, a Hungarian Jewish immigrant. Her husband's departure, combined with the crushing hardship of the Great Depression, slowly drained away whatever compassion she once possessed. Financial desperation transformed Dottie into a mother whose coldness bordered on cruelty. Throughout his childhood, Jacob grew up without ever knowing the warmth of a loving embrace, a comforting smile, or a gentle voice wishing him good night. Dottie viewed her two children less as objects of love than as financial burdens, draining what little strength she had left. She never once told Jacob she loved him. She never looked at him with pride. The emotional frost that filled their tiny apartment convinced Jacob, even as a young child, that his very existence was somehow a mistake. In 1931, when Jacob was 10 years old, Dottie moved the family to Kew Gardens in Queens, New York. They rented a shabby apartment directly above a lively neighborhood bar called Austin's Ale House. Every night, pounding music, clinking glasses, and drunken laughter drifted through the cracks in the wooden floorboards, mocking the suffocating silence that filled Jacob's home upstairs. Poverty forced the young boy into the workforce long before he should have been worrying about earning a living. During New York's sweltering summers, Jacob spent endless hours standing on street corners, selling newspapers, delivering groceries to wealthy families, and carrying trays of ice cream across scorching sandy beaches. But the hardest part wasn't the physical labor. Every evening, after dragging himself home with a handful of coins earned through sweat and exhaustion, Dottie would immediately snatch away every cent without offering a single word of encouragement. In doing so, she stripped away what little self-worth the young boy still possessed. Her cruelty reached its most devastating point during an accident that occurred while Jacob was still in elementary school. One afternoon, on a crowded street in Queens, a car lost control and slammed directly into him, leaving him with a badly broken left leg. Curled up in a cold hospital bed, terrified and in excruciating pain, Jacob stared through tear-filled eyes at the doorway, instinctively hoping his mother would rush in, embrace him, and cry beside him. The door finally opened. Dottie walked in, wearing an expression completely devoid of emotion. Without asking if her son was hurting, she walked to his bedside, stared at the cast wrapped around his shattered leg, and coldly said, "Do you have any idea how much this hospital bill is going to cost me?" Those words cut deeper than the impact of the car ever could. In that instant, every last illusion the 10-year-old boy had about a mother's love was shattered forever. The psychological scar from that moment would remain with him for the rest of his life. Home wasn't the only place where Jacob suffered. School offered no refuge either. At his local school in Queens, he became a frequent target of ridicule, exclusion, and prejudice because of his family's Jewish immigrant background. His classmates mocked him. Even some teachers treated him differently. Loneliness surrounded Jacob everywhere he went. There was no safe place. No one stood up for the frightened boy with the unusually large, bulging eyes who looked at the world with constant fear. The devastating combination of his mother's emotional neglect and society's rejection eventually pushed Jacob into severe clinical depression. The illness fully emerged during the bitter winter of 1936 when he was just 15 years old. Young Jacob Cohen lived in constant fear, plagued by crushing anxiety attacks that tightened his chest and left him convinced that he was someone who by nature simply didn't get any respect. Yet from the deepest darkness, a remarkable survival instinct quietly began to take shape. He realized that the world would never pity a miserable boy's tears. If he wanted to survive, Without losing his mind, there was only one option. He had to transform his own tragedies into laughter for everyone else. That same year, people began noticing a lonely teenage boy sitting quietly in the darkness of the tiny apartment above Austin's ale house. Beneath the dim glow of an oil lamp, Jacob filled scraps of paper and the backs of discarded cigarette packs with his very first self-deprecating jokes. And with those scribbled punchlines began the next 2 decades of Rodney's life, a journey so painfully dark that it would eventually force him to make the most brutal decision he had ever faced. In the winter of 1940, Jacob Rodney Cohen turned 19 years old. Desperate to escape the suffocating grip of his mother in their apartment in Queens, he made a pact with fate to bury the birth name that carried so much humiliation and reinvent himself under a new identity, Jack Roy. It was a name that sounded sharp, confident, and full of the swagger of a young city man ready to conquer the brightest lights of New York. Jack Roy entered the world of stand-up comedy with all the pride and innocence of youth. He believed that if he dared to lay bare his own pain on stage, the world would welcome him with open arms. Reality, however, struck him with a devastating blow. The entertainment industry of the 1940s had no room for an unknown performer with no connections and a style of self-deprecating comedy unlike anything audiences had ever seen. For the next 10 relentless years, the name Jack Roy sank into obscurity at the very bottom of the vaudeville world. Not a single major theater in Manhattan opened its doors to him. Instead, Jack wandered from one cheap nightclub to another, performing in run-down, smoke-filled bars around New York and throughout the Borscht Belt in the Catskill Mountains. Such was the tragedy of an unknown comedian. Every night, he climbed onto a crumbling stage to face drunken, indifferent audiences who were more than willing to hurl insults or even beer bottles onto the floor if his jokes failed to amuse them. The money from those performances was pitifully small. Some weeks, he earned little more than $12. When the lights went out and the curtain fell, Jack Roy would quietly retreat to run-down boarding houses for low-income workers along the outskirts of the city. Those rooms reeked of dampness and mildew, where he laid his exhausted body onto a torn bed-bug-infested mattress, staring up at the ceiling in overwhelming loneliness and permanent uncertainty about what the future held. Amid those dark years of struggle, in 1949, Jack Roy met and married Joyce Indig, a nightclub singer who was also desperately trying to find her place in show business. Their marriage seemed destined to become a source of strength for two struggling artists, weathering life's storms together. In reality, it marked the beginning of a long and painful tragedy. Joyce longed for a stable home and a husband with a dependable income to raise a family. Jack Roy, meanwhile, remained completely trapped in the dead end of his career. After their wedding, they welcomed 2 children into the world, Brian and Melanie. The arrival of their children unintentionally transformed an already crushing financial burden into a full-blown crisis that suffocated the young couple's lives. Their tiny New York apartment quickly became buried under mounting debt. Before this month's rent could be paid, next month's milk bill for the children was already due. Costly touring trips that brought in virtually no income pushed the family into desperate poverty. Cracks began appearing in Jack and Joyce's marriage that could never truly be repaired. Poverty slowly devoured their love, replacing it with endless arguments that lasted from night until morning. Joyce resented her husband for selfishly chasing an impossible dream, while Jack Roy was consumed by the helpless shame of a man who could no longer provide even a decent meal for his family. The black hole of depression that had haunted him since the age of 15 continued to expand, draining away every last ounce of strength and hope he had left. The most painful turning point came in 1951. By then, Jack Roy had reached the age of 30, an age that no longer allowed him the luxury of youthful dreams. After a disastrous performance at a remote nightclub, he stepped off the stage without hearing a single round of applause. Instead, all that greeted him were mocking laughter from the audience and the cold stare of the club owner, who tossed him a few loose coins as payment. In that moment, Jack Roy realized he had reached the end of his strength. He looked back on 12 years of struggling through his youth, at his exhausted body, the mountain of unpaid bills waiting at home, and the disappointment in his wife's eyes. The world had refused to acknowledge his existence. In one moment of overwhelming despair, Jack Roy made a decision as painful as tearing away a piece of his own flesh. He announced that he was quitting show business and throwing away the microphone. He chose to kill the artist named Jack Roy so that he could return to being an ordinary man named Jacob Cohen, accepting the bitter humiliation of defeat in exchange for the survival of his wife and children. Beginning in 1951, American comedy lost an unknown performer named Jack Roy, while New York society gained a traveling aluminum and glass salesman hurrying through its streets. For 12 consecutive years, from 1951 until 1962, Jacob Cohen took on every grueling manual labor job he could find just to pay off his debts. People saw him knocking on door after door, shop after shop throughout New York's working-class neighborhoods, trying to sell aluminum windows, reinforced glass frames, and inexpensive hardware accessories. It was a deeply humiliating profession for a man who had once possessed the soul of an artist. Every single day, Jacob endured cold refusals, doors slammed in his face, and dismissive insults as though he were nothing more than a beggar. The artistic dream that had once burned so brightly was now buried beneath stacks of unpaid bills, heavy hardware orders, and the dust of construction sites. Throughout those 12 anonymous years, Jacob Cohen endured the crushing loneliness and humiliation of a man society regarded as a failure. Former colleagues and audience members who had once watched him perform in small clubs now looked at him as nothing more than an unlucky middle-aged man, a defeated soul forced to abandon his ideals to become a traveling salesman. Every evening, after spending an exhausting day walking dozens of city blocks with a heavy briefcase filled with aluminum and glass catalogs, Jacob returned home, where his marriage to Joyce Indig remained suffocatingly cold, despite every effort to save it. He would isolate himself in a dark corner, stare at his hands hardened and calloused from carrying heavy metal hardware, and wonder whether his very existence had been nothing more than one long, cruel joke played by fate. But then came the defining turning point of his life, the day he decided to bury the old name forever and give birth to an entirely new identity. As the cold winds of early winter swept through the battered streets of New York, Jacob Cohen turned 40 with empty hands and a soul that had been completely shattered. His marriage of more than a decade to Joyce Indig finally collapsed beneath the crushing weight of poverty. Jacob walked away from their home, carrying little more than a few worn-out clothes. The unpaid debts from his aluminum and glass business, and the unbearable pain of being separated from his two young children, Brian and Melanie. At an age when most men had already built stable careers and families to come home to, Jacob found himself standing on the margins of society as a man utterly defeated. He had no home, no money, and no emotional support left. It was at the absolute bottom of despair that the middle-aged man realized one brutal truth during those 12 years of selling aluminum windows door to door. No matter how hard he had tried to bury his dream beneath sheets of metal, he had never truly been able to live without comedy. Laughter, the very thing he had abandoned, turned out to be the only rope capable of pulling him out of the swamp of depression. Jacob decided to return to the stage, but he knew that the slick-haired, handsome young Jack Roy of the 1940s had died long ago. A 40-year-old man with deep lines carved across his face, eyes weighed down by exhaustion and anxiety, could no longer walk onto a stage performing innocent hollow jokes. He needed a new identity, an entirely different persona that truly reflected the roughness and bitterness of the life he had lived. On a dark night in early 1962, a new stage name was officially born, Rodney Dangerfield. Changing his name was far more than a theatrical gimmick. It was a complete transformation of his mindset. Rodney abandoned every attempt to appear clever or sophisticated. Instead, he walked onto small nightclub stages, portraying a clumsy middle-aged man, drenched in nervous sweat, mercilessly exposing and humiliating his own miserable life before the audience.
My old man, he didn't help at all, my old man. We used to play tag and he'd drive.
He transformed his failed marriage, his less than handsome appearance, and the humiliation of being a traveling salesman into the very foundation of his comedy. America in the 1960s had never seen anything like it. This wasn't polished political satire or intellectual wit. It was relentless, brutally honest stand-up comedy that carried the unmistakable bitterness of real life. For the next 5 years, Rodney Dangerfield patiently earned every laugh one at a time in Manhattan's small nightclubs. Then came the defining moment of his life on the evening of Sunday, March 5th, 1967. Rodney was given the opportunity to appear on The Ed Sullivan Show, the most influential television program in America at the time, a show capable of turning a complete unknown into a national star in less than 10 minutes.
Now, I'll tell you, my apartment, nothing works. I got a radio, I can hardly hear it. I got a television set, I can't make out the picture. But when my wife opens her mouth, perfect reception. With my wife, we got nothing but arguments.
In truth, Rodney had only been called in as a last-minute replacement after another performer canceled. Stepping onto the stage at 46 years old, an age considered far too late for someone trying to break into show business, he suddenly found himself standing before the cameras of the entire nation. His appearance was instantly unforgettable. A black suit, his signature bulging eyes revealing an almost instinctive sense of panic, and a bright red necktie. Throughout his 10-minute live performance, Rodney constantly yanked and loosened that red tie, as though he were literally being strangled, sweat pouring down his face. Then, in his raspy, exhausted voice, he delivered the line that would forever change his life. "I don't get no respect."
Kid, I was an ugly kid, too. How ugly? I was so ugly, my mother breastfed me through a straw. I tell you, when I was a kid, I got no respect at all. You kid, no respect from anybody. You kidding? The time I was lost on the beach and a cop helped me look for my parents. I said to the cop, "You think we'll find them?" He said, "I don't know, kid, there's so many places they could hide."
He joked about a wife who refused to speak to him, about a psychiatrist who told him the only place he belonged was under the bed, and about a family dog that wouldn't even look at its owner. The audience at the Ed Sullivan Show exploded with roaring laughter and thunderous applause, unlike anything the program had witnessed before. In the span of a single night, the middle-aged man who had once sold aluminum windows door to door for a living reached the summit of success, becoming a cultural phenomenon across the United States. Behind that spectacular late-life breakthrough stood an almost obsessive work ethic. Rodney Dangerfield turned himself into a joke-writing machine. His style demanded extraordinary efficiency. Every 10 to 15 seconds had to deliver another laugh. There was no room for long introductions or slow storytelling. To maintain that relentless pace, Rodney wrote constantly everywhere he went. He would stop in the middle of a meal, interrupt a conversation, or even pull over while driving just to grab a pen and scribble down a new idea on whatever scrap of paper happened to be nearby, from old receipts and restaurant napkins to discarded cigarette packs he picked up along the street. His home and office became overflowing with cigarette boxes stuffed with hastily written jokes. He worshipped the craft of writing because he understood better than anyone the price the entertainment industry demanded from performers who failed to stay sharp. Yet behind Rodney's tough exterior on stage was a remarkably compassionate man. Rodney deeply understood the pain of struggling young comedians scraping together every dollar they could earn performing in tiny nightclubs. Because of that, he frequently spent his own money, willingly paying generous sums to purchase joke ideas and short punchlines from aspiring comedians simply to help them pay their bills. He also made a habit of inviting unknown young talents to open his major shows, giving them valuable stage time and the chance to catch the attention of influential producers. Among the completely unknown performers Rodney discovered and gave those priceless opening opportunities were two young comedians who would later become towering legends of Hollywood: Jim Carrey and Sam Kinison. When Jim Carrey was still struggling as a stand-up comic in small Toronto clubs, Rodney immediately recognized his extraordinary natural gift for physical comedy. He brought the young comedian onto his national tour as his opening act, for 2 consecutive years, paid him generously, and introduced him to members of the New York media.
When I talk about love, when I talk about relationships, I'm going to take the male side. You know, that's all I have to work with here, folks. But I love women. I do love women. I'm not with one right now because it's hard to do this act and mingle after the show. You know?
Rodney's generosity and kindness ultimately shattered the rumors and cynical accusations that he relied on ghostwriters because he had run out of ideas. Historical records and the testimony of fellow comedians consistently confirmed the opposite. Rodney Dangerfield was an independent comedic genius. His willingness to buy jokes or mentor young performers came entirely from the deep empathy of a man who had personally experienced the harshest rejection, humiliation, and loneliness life could offer. From that quiet generosity emerged one of the greatest ironies of his life. The man who spent his entire career telling audiences that he got no respect, ultimately earned the deepest respect imaginable from the very people who understood comedy best. People often wondered whether Rodney had ever truly found the respect he always claimed he lacked. The answer lives on through the towering legacy he left behind. His name was immortalized with a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. His comedy album, No Respect, earned a Grammy Award, and his unforgettable performances became part of America's cultural memory, providing laughter that has continued to comfort generations. Yet Rodney Dangerfield's greatest achievement was never measured by awards or honors. His lasting legacy was forged through the admiration of the world's greatest comedians, who viewed him as a pioneering giant, the man whose shoulders helped support the entire cathedral of modern stand-up comedy. Rather than keeping the spotlight for himself, he transformed Dangerfield's nightclub in Manhattan into a launching pad for countless future legends, from Jerry Seinfeld and Adam Sandler to Roseanne Barr. Through his immense influence and unwavering support for fellow performers, Rodney earned one of the highest honors imaginable among comedians and devoted fans alike, the Godfather of comedy. As the 1970s and 1980s unfolded, Rodney Dangerfield officially rose to become one of the most dominant forces in American entertainment. The grandest stage to showcase his reign was The Tonight Show, starring Johnny Carson. Appearing on the program more than 70 times, a record-breaking number, Rodney became an indispensable part of the nighttime routine for millions of American households.
The next day, I usually wake up in some strange place with a kid with an accent playing with my feet.
In 1969, together with his close friend Anthony Bevacqua, he opened his own comedy club, Dangerfield's, in the heart of Manhattan, New York. It quickly became the cathedral of stand-up comedy and the launching pad for an entire generation of future legends when they were still complete unknowns, including Jerry Seinfeld, Tim Allen, and Adam Sandler. Rodney didn't stop there. He went on to conquer Hollywood as well. His unforgettable performance as the obnoxious real estate millionaire Al Czervik in the 1980 comedy classic Caddyshack, followed by his starring role as the wealthy businessman Thornton Mellon in Back to School in 1986, generated tens of millions of dollars at the box office and transformed Rodney, now in his 60s, into one of America's richest and most powerful millionaire celebrities. Yet despite standing atop such extraordinary success, the psychological abyss carved into Rodney during childhood could never truly be filled. The admiration of millions of strangers meant almost nothing against the wounds left by his mother. Instead, those unresolved scars gradually pushed him toward an increasingly destructive path of self-destruction. In his memoir, It's Not Easy Bein' Me, Rodney openly admitted that he had become heavily addicted to marijuana. He smoked continuously from early morning until late at night, often consuming dozens of joints every single day, turning the drug into the only oxygen that seemed capable of keeping his mind functioning. At the same time, to suppress the overwhelming panic attacks and chronic depression that had followed him since the age of 15, Rodney became dependent on high doses of the powerful tranquilizer Valium, taking it before virtually every performance. Trying to escape the suffocating reality of his own mind, Rodney moved into the infamous Playboy Mansion, owned by Hugh Hefner in Los Angeles, where he lived for an extended period. There he immersed himself in endless nights of extravagant parties, surrounded by beautiful young women, desperately hoping that physical attention might temporarily replace the emotional acceptance he had never received. But every indulgence only deepened the emptiness inside him. The moment the curtain came down and the noise faded away, Rodney returned to being the frightened, paranoid child he had always been. Rejecting the luxury of lavish mansions, he often locked himself alone inside dark hotel rooms for hours at a time. Sitting silently in total darkness, he chain-smoked cigarette after cigarette without speaking to anyone. He withdrew from nearly all human interaction because he was haunted by an invisible conviction that everyone who entered his life would eventually exploit him, deceive him, or abandon him. The greatest and most heartbreaking tragedy during Rodney Dangerfield's years of enormous success wasn't his addiction. It was the lifelong rejection of his mother, Dottie Teitelbaum. After becoming a wealthy millionaire, Rodney purchased an expensive luxury apartment in the heart of Manhattan as a gift for her. He did it driven by one overwhelming childhood longing to finally hear a word of approval, receive a compliment, or catch even a single proud look from the woman who had spent her entire life rejecting him. The day Rodney proudly brought her to see the apartment, Dottie never looked at her son. She offered neither thanks nor affection. She simply glanced around the room, examined the ceiling, and coldly remarked, "The ceiling's too low." Those few words crashed into Rodney's heart like a bucket of ice water. Until the day she died, his mother never once acknowledged his success, congratulated him, or expressed the slightest pride in the son who had made an entire nation laugh. Rodney Dangerfield stood at the summit of the kingdom of comedy, adored by millions. Yet he remained at heart nothing more than a little boy who had failed to earn his own mother's approval. As the thunderous applause gradually faded behind the curtain, Rodney Dangerfield was forced to confront another cruel reality. His body had begun demanding payment for decades spent buried beneath marijuana smoke and tranquilizers. The sturdy frame that had once commanded the biggest stages in America gradually deteriorated into exhaustion and frailty. Years of heavy Valium abuse used to suppress overwhelming panic attacks had severely damaged both his cardiovascular and nervous systems. The king of self-deprecating comedy found himself moving endlessly between hospitals, enduring one major surgery after another. At one point, he underwent complex brain surgery to improve blood circulation simply to prepare for another life-threatening heart operation. By the time he reached his 70s, Rodney entered the darkest and weakest chapter of his life, battling relentless physical pain while death waited patiently nearby. Yet in the middle of that physical and emotional collapse, a late miracle finally appeared to bring light back into his life. Her name was Joan Child. Joan possessed extraordinary compassion and an unconditional kind of love. She never saw Rodney as a wealthy entertainment icon, nor was she drawn to Hollywood glamour. Instead, she looked beyond the comedian's public persona and found the frightened little boy named Jacob Cohen, still trembling alone inside the aging man's body. They were married in late December, 1993. Every day, Joan patiently cared for him, preparing his meals, organizing his medication, and quietly listening as Rodney finally spoke about the terrifying memories of his childhood. Whenever panic attacks or paranoid fears overwhelmed him, Joan would hold his hand and gently promise that she would never abandon him the way his father, Philip Cohen, had done during the winter of 1921. Joan Child's compassion and understanding finally gave Rodney Dangerfield something that millions of standing ovations and endless cigarettes had never been able to provide: peace. Protected by his wife's quiet devotion, Rodney devoted what little strength remained to confronting himself honestly. He no longer relied on powerful tranquilizers to steady his mind. Instead, he poured his energy into writing the final book of his life, a memoir that stripped away every illusion. Behind his famous catchphrase, "I don't get no respect," that memoir, "It's Not Easy Being Me," became Rodney's final act of redemption. He didn't write it to polish his legacy. He wrote it as the most honest confession of his life, a conversation with himself, and ultimately a path toward healing. Because of Joan's love, the final years of the king of self-deprecating comedy were no longer spent hiding alone inside dark hotel rooms. Instead, they were warmed by the quiet peace of a genuine home, a place where, for the first time in his life, he could smile without hiding behind the mask of Rodney Dangerfield. When the oxygen mask was finally removed at UCLA Medical Center, Rodney Dangerfield took his last breath. His extraordinary 82-year journey, a life marked by deep fractures yet remarkable dignity, had come to an end. That night, something unprecedented happened in tribute to him. From the glowing neon theaters of Las Vegas to the bustling comedy clubs of Manhattan marquees across the country, simultaneously went dark for one silent minute. The kingdom of comedy bowed its head to bid farewell to its king, finally allowing the soul of Jacob Cohen to rest after carrying the weight of childhood trauma for nearly a century. Only after Rodney's passing did the public begin to fully understand the hidden psychological code behind his performances. For decades, audiences believed that his constant habit of tugging and loosening his bright red necktie was simply part of his act. It wasn't. In conversations with his wife, Joan Child, later in life, Rodney confessed that every time he stood before an audience, he genuinely felt as though he couldn't breathe. That suffocating sensation wasn't imaginary. It was the psychological scar left behind by a mother whose cruelty had strangled his self-worth since childhood. The famous gesture of yanking at his red tie therefore became the ultimate symbol of Rodney's lifelong struggle for survival. He had to pull it loose just to breathe, just to survive another panic attack, and just to find enough strength to keep performing, to keep turning humiliation into a weapon against fate. During his lifetime, audiences and the media often mistook Rodney Dangerfield for someone as pathetic and unfortunate as the self-deprecating character he portrayed on stage. But the true legacy he left behind was one of profound respect for humanity. Rodney never used comedy to mock, belittle, or humiliate others. Instead, he chose to ridicule himself, transforming the pain of being disregarded into a proud form of artistic survival. And after finally reaching the highest levels of fame and success, he devoted that influence to lifting up an entire generation of young comedians, giving them respect and opportunities at a time when they were still complete nobodies. Today, if you ever walk beneath the quiet green trees of Westwood Village Memorial Park Cemetery in Los Angeles, you'll find Rodney Dangerfield's grave resting peacefully beneath the indifferent California sun. The flat marble headstone bears no lengthy tribute and no grandiose list of accomplishments. Instead, engraved upon it are only the final self-deprecating words that Rodney personally chose before his death, "There goes the neighborhood." One final joke left behind for the living, a defiant farewell from the little boy once known as Jacob Cohen. His story ends with the sound of thousands of people laughing captured forever on an old black and white recording. It is a lonely sound, echoing through silence, yet one that somehow carries the feeling of permanent redemption for a soul that completed its life's mission, bringing joy to the world.